Right.
So yes, as you mentioned, we were here today to speak about the Roman Republic. The last time we spoke, we talked about like history, and I loved the fact that we talked about war and how the war back then and the modern parallels that we had, and I really enjoyed that. So we're back again today to talk about how empires fall.
Yeah.
And I love that conversation. I love that topic because it kind of reminds me how these things that we have, these systems, they're not going to last.
Yeah.
Like we've seen the Roman Republic and how that grew to become the biggest republic ever, and then it fell.
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating to talk to people about how the systems are failing, and just so we are aware of that.
Yeah.
To start with Rome. Rome at its peak was the kind of epitome of what an empire should be. His democracy, his armies, his structure, his all of that, and even that fell. So I think that's why I've been fascinated to speak to you. I know we still often talk about stuff like this.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have the conversation today.
Yeah, no, I'm excited too. And it's like you say, like the fall of a republic and the fall of a democracy, which has happened before in history, obviously. But like the scale at which it happened in Rome, and like the well-documented style of history telling that we have from that time, it really makes it special. So it's a really fascinating time to discuss.
Yeah, 100%. And I think let's start with them understanding like definitions and stuff like that. So with the Roman Republic, can you speak to me a little bit more about what that was meant to be, what that was presented as, and what the Republic and kind of like its democracy was for the people back then?
Yeah, I mean that pretty much ties into the founding of the Roman Republic and the story that is attached to how the Republic formed and how the Romans saw it ultimately. Because all of you might know that Rome didn't start out as a democracy, they didn't start out as a republic, they started out as a monarchy. The first king of Rome was Romulus, the founder of Rome. Famous story with him killing his brother and then founding the city essentially. He was also supposed to be the son of Mars, so the Roman god of war. And that's kind of the style in which Rome was founded. So already kind of like a very bloody, aggressive, expansionist kind of way in which Rome perceives itself. So that's kind of like the self-image of the Romans. Then we have 5 more kings after Romulus. All of them seem to be pretty good at it. All of them are, either great warriors, great leaders and strategists, or they're great spiritual leaders, great, lawmakers and people who are establishing traditions and who are kind of like establishing peace. And that was kind of a good rhythm for the early Roman monarchy, I guess. But then we come to the 7th king, who is Tarquinius Superbus. And that's a great name. We're going to encounter a lot of great names today. But Tarquinius Superbus is especially great because his surname, Superbus, means proud. It means proud. And proud not in a good way, but in a way of like being excessively proud. I guess vainglory might be a good term for it as well. Or like someone who just thinks themselves to be the best and the greatest and can't do no wrong, even though they might be very flawed themselves. So Tarquinius Superbus was the 7th king of Rome. Allegedly got into power through like a coup, and then essentially was just a tyrant. So like he killed anyone who was potentially dangerous to him. He did a bunch of stuff that oppressed the Roman people, took a bunch of freedoms away, was apparently just a very morally morose person. And the Roman populace suffered. And there was malcontent growing, but people were scared because this guy, he would kill even someone who was like, even if they didn't say anything against him, if he felt like this person is powerful enough or rich enough or smart enough, then I'm just going to kill him. So this is where we come finally to the founder of the Roman Republic, who I feel like exemplifies what the Republic was supposed to be. Maybe not in his early life, but once we get to like his actual great deeds, then we will learn more. But like in his early life, actually, he survived this Roman oppression because he pretended to be stupid. So he pretended to be kind of like not very mentally there. He pretended to be kind of very simple so that he wouldn't be perceived as a threat. He still managed to have a family and have children, but he had this kind of public farce going on. And that's what his name Brutus, I think, is supposed to mean as well. Like Brutus is supposed to mean like kind of like dull or slightly dumb. All of this is to say that everything was kind of going downhill. People were very scared. And then things started to boil over when the son of Tarquinius Superbus, so the son of the king, a woman. I think that woman's name was Lucretia. And Lucretia was a young daughter of a patrician family. So the patricians in Rome, those are kind of like the noble families, like the very wealthy ones, by the son of the king. And then she killed herself, more or less publicly, out of this trauma, essentially, and announced it to the world what happened, and then killed herself with a dagger. And this was the moment when everything boiled over. Like the Roman people, they were kind of like, you know, all this way, they were like, okay, you know, he's killing his enemies, he's doing this, he's doing that. And like, this is what they could, I guess, still abide by. But when it came then to kind of like this really morally wrong thing that he's done to like this completely innocent person, this completely innocent woman, and that led then to her suicide, like the cutting short of this young life that was still blooming. This was when the Roman people rose up. And I guess this tells you one thing about what the Romans perceive themselves at, like their character, that they don't want to suffer these kind of moral injustices. When it comes to other stuff like power plays and wars and whatever, that might be more understandable. But when it comes to just, you know, doing evil for evil's sake, or like for just to want to somehow satisfy yourself to like do something so morally abhorrent as like this is when the Romans were like, you know what, stop. And Brutus finally stopped pretending to be stupid. He also kind of like was like, okay, this is a line, and we're gonna have to rise up. So he led the uprising together with the patrician family whose daughter killed herself. And they overthrew the king. They exiled the king and his family and his followers. And this is when they started to instate a republic. And, you know, things were specifically built in a way that, you know, there's a balance of powers. There is a balance so that no one can be too powerful within the state. There's 2 consuls. There's the Senate made up of patricians. There are the different assemblies which vote on laws and vote for the different officials. And it was specifically made so that a king like Tarquinius, someone who is morally just abhorrent and who can just abuse this power, so that a king like this can never come back again. And you know, this was another founding idea, I guess. So this balance of power, something we still see today quite a bit, being talked about and being taken very seriously. And also, of course, like the rule of law, that, you know, like you can't just rape someone and get away with it, even if you're a king. Those were the very foundational ideas of Rome. However, the story goes on, and in that story you learn a little more about like what the Republic was meant to be, because this king actually comes back. Tarquinius Superbus comes back, tries to reinstate himself, and initially he tries to do it via a coup, like so he tries to recruit people within the city of Rome to let him back in and support him in power. And this coup gets discovered, and Brutus discovered that 2 of his sons were among the conspirators trying to bring back the old king. And the story goes that Brutus himself declared that they should be executed and presided himself over their execution. And it is said that he was completely stoic during the whole ordeal. He was just stone-faced, cold, didn't show any emotion. Even when they died, he didn't say anything, he didn't do anything. And kind of like executed his duty to the fullest degree. Later on, at their funeral, it is said that he cried and pulled out his hair and tore open his clothes. So he was obviously very distraught. But the important things are in the story is that he executed like his duty as a Roman citizen and as a Roman consul. He executed that before even his duty as a father. So he took that more seriously than, you know, a father who might want his children to live and to be happy and healthy.
You put the idea of Rome and the Republic ahead of his own.
Exactly.
On that point, actually, I think first of all, thank you. That was amazing. Like actually the backstory and history is
one of my favorite stories. Actually,
I just heard it for the first time, and that's like really impressive. On that point about the ideals that held together the Republic.
Yeah.
When Brutus took over, they must have got together and said, these are what we stand by. Obviously, the insurrection started because of this action that happened. So there must have been a kind of understanding amongst them that we actually stand for this. We stand for freedom. We stand for civic duty. We stand for... Talk to me more about that. What were some of the ideals that Rome itself kind of declared, or the Republic declared that it stood for once it became what it was?
That's a very good question. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Rome is that they tie kind of like the moral purpose and like what they stand for very much to religious purpose as well. So this is something we see much later in literature, in the Roman literature, for example, in the Aeneid, which is kind of like this massive Roman epic in the style of the Iliad and the Odyssey, about Aeneas, who was the founder of a city that was kind of like the father or mother city of Rome, I guess. Or I guess like it's even like two cities removed. So from the city sprung another city, and from that other city sprung Rome, I guess. But the purpose of Rome and like the kind of values that it stood for, at least at that point, was very much tied to, okay, divine purpose. The gods declared that Rome is special. It's that city on a hill. You see that a lot. I mean, like this term "city on a hill," like it's
biblical too. I know that it can't still say referred to in the Bible, but keep going.
Yeah, exactly. So like you know, this is something that came kind of like with Rome, and that was somewhat special about Roman history as well, because I can't think of many other states, many other empires at that time and beforehand who thought themselves to be kind of like imbued with this divinity. And I mean, it starts already with Romulus, who comes from Mars, obviously. Like Rome ties itself very closely to its gods. Really, the only other state I can think of, like beforehand, that really wanted this divine purpose was the Persian Empire, where the king was said to have like this divine connection to the greatest deity in their religion. So yeah, I guess this kind of like divine purpose is something that even the Republic tied itself to. Then obviously the Empire much more. But when it comes to the values of like freedom and equality, they espoused actually less of these values specifically than they espoused values like stoicism or like emotional control and sacrifice. Actually, that was a very big one. So even though I'm sure words like freedom and words like democracy meant a lot to them, to Romans, as far as I can tell from like their literature, it was much more about civic duty. It was much more about, I'm going to sacrifice everything to the state. I'm going to sacrifice myself and my well-being for the well-being of others, which, you know, you might say is a democratic idea. Like if you feel that your state represents every single one of your neighbors, every single one of your people, then you can definitely say, okay, me sacrificing myself for that is me sacrificing myself for my fellow people.
Yes.
My, you know, like the democratic structure of my state.
It's almost like a true idea of democracy. I mean, nowadays we look at it, probably it's kind of like the idea that communist countries would espouse, like we're actually not an individual, we're part of a collective, and to work for the collective is actually what will instill the individual some purpose or some sort of like, you know, safety, because if the hive mind is actually well, then the individual self doesn't really matter as much.
Exactly.
I think though that it's fascinating to see how it kind of develops, how it kind of erodes over time, that ideal. Yeah. I think that's what I'm fascinated by too. Let's get into kind of the democracy, because to give it more of an overview, what I'm really focused on, what I'm really interested in is how these ideals like Rome over time erode, and the symptoms of that erosion, where that comes from. You know, we've mentioned a little bit about these individuals, you know, and then later we're going to talk about how people like Caesar and how these Augustus, how they were a symptom of the ideals that the civil duty will have, and having that kind of idea against that, or maybe for that, and how that relates to what we have today. You know, we've talked about it before, about how wealth is kind of seen today as that kind of like media between the influences people have and the responsibility they have. The people actually on the top have so much wealth, have so much influence, that the idea of democracy isn't really being implemented as well. And I think there was the same thing with kind of Rome. So going back to Rome a little bit, and you just kind of keep going what you were speaking about. What was their idea of democracy? How was it structured? You know, they had a Senate, you mentioned, they had a consul, and they had like how the people voted for it. Speak more about those kind of three structures and how kind of the interplay between that.
So